Decolonization can be worded in many different ways. Decolonization is the act of getting rid of colonization or freeing a country from being dependent on another country. It can also be defined as the undoing of colonialism, where a nation establishes and maintains its domination over dependent territories. When Africa was in the process of being colonized, it was referred to as the Scramble of Africa or the Race for Africa. It was a process of invasion, occupation, and colonization. Europeans used their power to take control of African territory during the New Imperialism period between 1881 and World War I in 1914. Europeans officially colonized Africa in the late 19th century. This was an extremely huge event in history. Therefore, one scholar in particular called the colonization of Africa one of the most dramatic processes of political emancipation in the world. Europeans used their powers and divided Africa and its resources into political partitions at the Berlin Conference of 1884. Attempts to mediate imperial competition, such as the Berlin Conference, failed in all of their attempts. Many African states and rulers prepared to fight the European aggression in trying to colonize Africa. Sadly, during the Industrial Revolution, Europe gained access to advanced weapons, which made it harder for Africa to compete with. By 1905, the European government controlled almost all of African soil. However, they did not control Ethiopia or Liberia. On February 12, 1941, United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill met to discuss the post war world. This resulted in the Atlantic Charter. One of the provisions on the document introduced by Roosevelt was the autonomy of imperial colonies. The Atlantic Charter put more pressure on Britain after World War II to abide the terms of the Atlantic Charter. When British Prime Minister Winston Churchill introduced the charter to Parliament, he purposely mistranslated when speaking to the colonies to make it easier to get the charter passed. After the war, African colonies were only introduced to democratic governments at a local level because they were still seen and considered as immature and childlike. Religion in West Africa at the time, for the most part, was made up of Christianity and African traditional religion. African traditional religion was the religion of indigenous beliefs. In a way, it summed up the religion for all Africans at the time. However, it did not include the religion of Christianity or Islam. Islam was introduced in a slow process, by word of mouth from Islamic scholars and traders. Muslims began trading with other Muslims and non-Muslims. By the 14th century, the Hausa city-states were almost made up of all Muslims. However, a majority of Africans did not convert until the 18th century. In the 18th century, when most Muslims began to convert to Islam, a series of jihads were launched which tried to corrupt the ways of Hausa. A community in Western Africa made up of mostly Muslims, ran by Ibrahim, used its swords for political liberation. It offered a new identity as it evolved more Muslims into Western Africa. Cultural and political resistance and anti-colonialism spread throughout Africa and the Muslim community. The Muslim community was a way to allow Muslims to renew their cultural meaning and give them the ability to make political introductions in the context of decolonization. The Muslims in this community took matters into their own hands, which helped with their Muslim following throughout the continent. Crawford Young, a professor of political science, said Islam represented the most comprehensive ideological challenge to hegemony available to Africa at the moment of subjugation. During the time of Africa being colonized by Europe, the Muslim community used their power to make political decisions while also involving less influential Muslims in the community. Because of this, Islam spread across the continent.